Okay, I'm going to take a really deep breath and try to get through this income statement projections. It shouldn't be that difficult, but people tend to make it more difficult than it is. I think it's primarily because they think that there's a right answer. We are talking about the future here. There probably is a right answer. No one knows it. So kind of get over it. We're trying to do the best that we can to come up with a very good, not necessarily the right answer. And so to get us going on this income statement projection and to get the principles down, not the right answer, but the principles, and then following those principles, we'll come up with a good income statement projection. I hate to do this again, but yeah, I have to start with the same thing that I started the last video with, which is the model, okay? So deal with it. Key to success, being balanced. Again, we're talking about the market for goods and services and the business saying, hey, I think I can approach this market in a better way, and therefore the business was started because it can approach that and come up with the goods and services that are demanded by the market, and the market is going to want to give them money based on the price quality combination. That's the idea. If the business is successful, then it's going to have processes in place that can produce those really high quality goods for that particular price. Those processes will demand the assets. They will specify what assets should be there. And if management is efficient enough, then the market for goods and services will say, well, I guess you probably can do this. And it will give them money to fund those assets, given some risk and some return. So they'll be looking at what they perceive to be the risks, and they will come up with a specified return. Those business processes themselves will create that return. And here's the real kicker, because the top part of this diagram is really the focus of the income statement projections that we're going to be doing. We're trying to model these goods and services being sold to the market. The amount of sales is really telling me all about how much has been demanded and the willingness the market is to pay that price given the quality I can produce, and how much it costs me to create that product or service vis-a-vis the price I'm charging and all of my overhead will give me a return on my investment. We're really looking at the top portion of this only. We're not really even looking at all the debt and equity that's coming in. We're not looking at the assets. We're not looking at any of that, but we are looking really closely, especially at the stuff in the middle where the dollars come into the business. They go through a business process. They create products that the market will then demand even more of, and they throw off cash to the market for debt and equity. Those are the things that we're going to be modeling here. Here's how we're going to approach this. And I'm going to break this into small pieces like I try to do, and hopefully this is working for you. So this is planning step 2, and this is where we're going to start in projecting our income. We're going to set up the income statement projections. We're going to set up a space for them, okay? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to start by copying the most recent income statement and the sales projection to another file. This is going to be really easy because all we have to, well, I'll show it to you in a second. Second, we're going to get rid of all the lines that don't have a formula. So we'll just get rid of all of the base numbers. That was the reason that one of the reasons that we wanted to get our income statement set up with formulas in all the right places, because where there are formulas, we don't have to project anything. The income statement will do it for us. So hopefully we did that one right. Third, we're going to identify whether the amount in that line of the income statement is somehow correlated to sales. This is not done statistically. At least we won't do it in this class statistically, because quite frankly, our sample sizes are puny. And so I'm not sure we could do it justice. So instead, I'm asking you to actually think through this and say, should the cost of goods sold be tied to sales? I'm hoping you can see that the answer is yes. And then, should the selling, general, and administrative expenses of the company be tied to sales? That one's a little harder, but usually the answer is yes. Some other lines on the income statement really shouldn't. They really don't have anything to do with sales. It's sort of like, these are the costs of doing business, and they're kind of fixed, or it doesn't really matter how high sales are right now. They're going to be that at whatever level they're going to be. Those, not so much. So we're going to identify the ones that are tied to sales, and then we're going to identify lines that can be estimated using other methods. For instance, the interest expense. We've already done our amortization schedule, and therefore we have an interest expense. We're going to bring that over. Another one would be the tax. Income tax, there's a line on there for income tax, and if we go back and we say, well, what is usually their average tax rate? We can usually come pretty darn close to what it's going to be in future just by looking at what it's been in the past, so we can come up with a number for that one as well. Then all other lines we're just going to hold constant. We're going to talk about how we're going to hold it constant in a little bit. Right now, though, we're going to go over to our income statement. This is the actual income statement. This is what happened 2008 through 2013. At this point, we want to create a space, so to speak, to throw our income statement projections. And the easiest way of doing this from my perspective is grabbing this tab that's already highlighted, the income statement tab, and then I'm going to click on the sales projection. And now both of these, you'll notice, are lighter than the rest of them because they're both selected together. And at this point, I'm going to click on either one of them, but this time I'm going to use the right mouse button and choose Move or Copy. And the very first thing I need to do is create a copy. That will leave these originals here so I can come back and get them anytime I want to. But I'm going to go up and choose New Book. By the way, this has everything open that I have open right now. I am going to be eventually using my amortization schedule, so if you wanted a preview of where I'm going to go in the near future, that's where I'm going. So I'm now looking at my new book. It's creating a new book as soon as I hit OK. And you'll notice it did create a new book. The book says Book 1, and now I'm going to move it so that you can't see that. Not so that you can't see it, but so that it works better for us. And this information over here is actually interesting information. Eventually I would like to use some of it, and I don't want to have to be going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it. And notice we're on the copy of this, so we're not losing anything. As I paste, I hit my left mouse button or right mouse button, and I went down to Paste Special, and I'm going to say Values and OK. These used to have formulas in them. They don't anymore. That's 100%. That's 65.88303932494. Oh, it was 8%. And then these, the reason I did that, by the way, is because I can then come over here and get rid of anything that has a number in it. I can see that that one has just numbers, that one has just numbers, and I'm just looking up here as I move my way down. So that one has numbers, that one has numbers, that one doesn't. It has a formula. So I'm going to come back up here and grab all of those and hit delete. I know you're thinking, you lost a bunch of things. No, this is the copy, remember? Chill. So that one's a number, 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 that one's a formula. Okay, so again, I grab all of those, hit delete. Anything now that says 0 I know is actually a formula. So I'm coming down here, that's a number, that's a number, that's a number. That's a formula. So I go back up and I do the same thing. And delete. I'm going down here. Income statement or income taxes. Yeah, get through all those and then hit delete. And that takes me all the way through net income. That's all I need to go through is the line that says net income. And by the way, this stuff down here is earnings per share. Okay, so that's ready. Now I'm going to think through this and say, should this be tied to sales? Well, yeah, that is sales, so I'm going to skip that one and say, okay, how about this one? The answer is yeah, probably that one should be tied to sales. The ones that are tied to sales, I'm going to just turn yellow. This one could be estimated using sales as well, selling, and some of the administrative duties would go up, not all of them. As we have more and more sales, we're going to have more general and administrative expenses. As we have fewer sales, those may go down. There's a portion of that that may be fixed, there's a portion of it that may be completely variable, but they should go up and down a little bit with sales. There should be some correlation. Acquisition related expenses. Well, if I acquire things, I don't acquire things, more things, just because of sales. I would actually have to have, well, cash. So that one's probably not. Restructuring charges, probably not. Non-cash tangible impairment charges. Wow, that one most people are going to have no freaking clue what that's talking about. Notice as we come over here, though, that all of these areas on mine had a number only one time in the last 6 years. The rest of the time it's been 0. So I'm thinking all of those are not tied to sales. This one is tied to something completely different, so I'm going to just turn it, whoops. Oh, actually I did want it green. I thought I'd clicked on blue for a minute there, so that's good. Gain on bargain purchase. Well, again, I'm thinking that one's not tied to anything. And this one is, well, all over the place. It certainly isn't tied to sales. Quite frankly, anything below income from operations generally is not tied to sales. These are not regular operating expenses or benefits or anything, and so anything down here usually isn't tied to sales. This one is turned green because I do have a way of getting to it, and it's a little bit different from anything else. And I think the income tax expense, I'm going to use something different on that one. So the two yellow ones are somehow tied directly to sales. These have different ways of approaching them. And what I'm suggesting with these others is we're either going to have to chin them based on what they've done in the past, because some of them may grow slightly. And if so, use your head and do whatever it looks like is what's going on. But others of them just don't have any connection with anything else that I have on this sheet, and I'll probably just say, well, what has it been on average, and just go with that because I have no other way of projecting them. So at this point we're ready to move on to the next instruction in the PowerPoint slides. So at this point we're going to drop our sales projections into the sales line. We're going to throw our interest expense into the correct line, making sure, and this is different for not every, but it's like 50-50 whether this goes in as a positive or a negative. So be careful the way this is thrown in there. There will be some hints, and I'll show you some of the hints on mine that will get us to get this right. But we need to get the sign right. Don't just blindly follow this along. Number 3, we're going to look at the appropriate tax rate, and we're going to, again, get this hardwired in. Even though it's going to be wrong up front, we're going to put a formula in there so that as we adjust things, it will automatically adjust things, and I won't have to go back and rethink it all the time. And again, make sure you get that sign right. Now, in my case, I'm not going to stop and say, oh, I need to get this sign right, because quite frankly, mine's listed as a positive. In some instances, this is listed as a negative. Please get it right, otherwise you'll be adding the tax. It's like, wow, I'm making even extra money because the IRS is giving me money. Yeah, like that's likely. With that, let's move back over to our Excel sheet and start doing these. We'll drop the sales into the sales line, get the interest expense, and look at the taxes. So when I copied these two over, I did copy both over, including the sales projections. So these are the sales projections that we talked about in our last video. I'm just going to highlight all of them, and I'm going to say copy. Move over to the income statement, sit right here, right click, paste special, transpose. I do not have to do, well, whoops, and I need to tell it values. Values and transpose. I don't have to do any formatting. In fact, it's best I don't, because this was already formatted before, and I want something that's going to look really close to what we had before. So I'm going to say OK. And it dropped them in. Now, mind you, these are for 2014. Whoops, let me try that again. 2014, 2015. And you'll notice that I actually have projected 5, but I had 6. So what I'm going to do is just get rid of that last one because I don't need it. Second, it says I'm going to come down here and get this interest expense. Now, this one, first off, let me move this over. This one I really didn't spend much time on in the video. My company actually has Rocky Brands has $38,388,198, which is in what it calls a credit facility. If you look at the credit facility, and I have quarter by quarter, it will go up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. That's really a revolving loan. And since I can't predict at this point how much there's going to be needed in this credit facility, I'm just going to hold it constant for right now. When I get to the balance sheet, we will no longer hold it constant, and I'm going to show you what actually happens with this at that point. So at this moment, I'm using the 1.5-ish%, so 150, what are called 150 basis points. That's take LIBOR rate, add 1.5 to it, and we get the interest rate. This is that's kind of a made-up number, and what I ended up doing is, because I'm just holding it constant, they're just paying exactly the interest payment all the time. That's essentially all we're modeling them doing. So we're modeling them holding the same amount over 5 years and just paying the interest on it, just so you can see what we're doing. And then later on, don't worry, when we hit the balance sheet projections, we're going to tweak this, so hang in there. So I'm going to highlight these, I'm going to copy them, and then I'm going to move over to the income statement projections. Now note that in the income statement projections I have other income and expenses. Notice expenses are in parentheses. This is not just saying other income and expenses. That's not what it's doing. It's saying other income. If they're expenses, they are negative. That's why it's in parentheses. That's the first clue. Second clue is if we look at this as a percent of sales, note that these are all negatives. I'm thinking that these are usually listed as negatives. Just call me crazy. So I'm going to sit right on top of this first one, do a right mouse button, go up to paste special, and you're thinking I'm going to do values. You're correct. Remember, the formats are already there. But to get the sign right, I'm actually going to tell it to subtract. Therefore, it will take whatever's in that cell and subtract the amount that I have listed in my amortization schedule, which in this case is positive. And so if I take 0 and minus a positive number, then it will input it as a negative. That's the philosophy here. So I'm going to say OK, and it drops those in place. The last thing we're going to look at in this particular step is the income tax expense. Yeah, you can see that I have a whole bunch of junk down here that I'm going to ignore right now, by the way. So income tax expense. For this one, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go back to the income statement itself, the actual. Okay, here we are on the income statement again, the actual income statement, Now what I'm really interested in finding is what is income tax expense as a percent of income before income taxes. That's the only thing I'm interested in at this moment, because that's how I'm going to model this particular line of the income statement. So I'm going to drop down here to the bottom somewhere where I have empty space and type in, average tax rate. And what I mean by average tax rate is when we're looking at everything you paid and then tell me everything that was in income before taxes, and we're just going to assume an average rate rather than the marginal tax rate, which is the tax rate on the last dollar. So I'm going to say equals income tax expense divided by income before income taxes. Enter. And then format it like a percent, which I've already done here, and then I'm going to pull that one across through all of those. And we have 31%, 32%, 31%, 32%, 36%, 37%, and then negative 116%. One of these things is not like the other. I'm thinking it's the last one, so I'm going to get rid of that one because that one's just crazy. I'm going to highlight the others. Notice the most recent one's about 32%, and I have an overall average of 32.69%. Because the average is higher than, and I mean the average is higher than the most recent average tax rate, then I'm going to go with the overall average because it's a little bit more conservative. So I'm going to do the 32.69%. So the way I do the 32.69% is I say equal 0.3269 times whatever number is in here. Now I'm setting this up as a formula. It's not going to lock these numbers in place. It's going to readjust every time I put more stuff in here. Now, because I want this to just be about my projections, because I've already changed these numbers up here, I'm also going to hold constant my weighted average number of common shares outstanding, because that's probably the best estimate of what I've got outstanding right now. So I'm just going to pull that across. These are wrong because I don't have all my costs in there, so just bear with me. And then all of this junk in between is probably, well, just that. It's junk. So I'm going to just get rid of everything else that's here. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is just delete it. There we go. And this is of the copy again, so we haven't lost anything that's real. These are just guesstimates anyway. And so at this point, that brings us to our next PowerPoint slide. So now we're going to project those lines that are tied to sales. Those were the ones that I painted yellow, by the way. We have hypothesized, and at this point we're going to hypothesize a little bit. We're going to say, should this have some fixed cost in it and some variable, or should it just be nothing but variable cost? If we've hypothesized both, then I would usually recommend doing a regression analysis. And what we're going to be looking at in particular is a regression model that looks like this: y equals b plus mx, just so you can see what I'm talking about. So we have a fixed component, we have a variable component times x. So this is my slope, this is my intercept, and then this is my x variable. I'm hoping you can see that. So fixed portion is the intercept, variable portion is a slope coefficient, and it will tell me the cents per dollar. The fixed portion will just be how many dollars are fixed. The variable portion will be cents on the dollar, and then I'll say how many dollars in sales, and that will together all of that will give me a best estimate of Y, which is total whatever cost I'm looking at. To estimate the fixed and variable portions, we're going to use the regression modeling functions as we described in the earlier video. The Y variable is going to be whichever subject cost we're looking at. The X variable is going to be sales. Excel is going to estimate the fixed and the variable components. So we'll estimate this chunk, it will estimate this chunk, and then we will apply that to come up with the next chunk, well, with the full chunk. In each case, we will typically look at statistical tests to assess whether the relationship exists between the cost and the sales. The problem is we're going to be using such small sample sizes that practically nothing's going to be statistically significant. If yours happen to be statistically significant, you know, kudos to you, but that doesn't mean much with such a small sample size. If we had larger sample sizes, which is what you'd have if you did this with quarterly data for 5 years, then we could talk about using that as one of the tests to say, well, if there isn't much of a relationship there, then maybe we should think that all of it's fixed instead of it having any variable component. But at this point, because we're going to be using such small sample sets, yeah, we're just going to have to use our head and say, yeah, that's probably about as good as we can get. So after using the regression, use your head. Since we can't rely too much on the statistics of this thing, we're going to have to say, well, I'm going to use my head and say this is how much, this is the model I think is going to work, and that's the model that I don't think is going to work at all, and we're going to want to tweak things afterwards as well. So for lines of the income statement that you believe are largely variable, which means I don't think they have a fixed component at all, we're going to use input from the common size income statement to say here's the percent of sales, period. And then we're going to take that percent, multiply it by the sales projected for that year, and we'll tie them together in a formula. And the reason for that is then if we make an adjustment to our sales projections, we don't really have to go back and reinvent the wheel or even think through the entire system all over again, because the Excel modeling system has already done that for us. If the regression doesn't seem to work at all, or you're going, well, I'm thinking these are really fixed costs, then we're either going to hold that figure constant at its most recent level, or we're going to take some average over the past few years. If you happen to see a trend, you know, this is growing at a certain rate, then by all means have that continue. Do what seems to be making sense to you. In all instances, therefore, use your head. I know you've all been thinking, wow, that one was a long PowerPoint component. Yeah, it kind of was. So let's go into our actual, well, this isn't the actual, this is the estimated. We're going to be hitting these two yellow ones right now, and then we're going to be hitting all of my fixed stuff. Okay, so we'll do the regression stuff and the common sizing stuff. We'll try to figure out which of these two really belongs where, or whether they're both the same one. And then we'll hit everything that's kind of fixed, everything else that we've got listed there, and then we should be finished with the income statement projections. And in fact, this should automatically change. The net income should automatically change as we add things. Now, I'm going to do a regression for both of these, the cost of goods sold and the selling general and administrative. To do that, though, we're going to need the data from both of them. So I'm going to go back to the actual numbers, scroll up, find my cost of goods sold, and copy, and then I'm going to come over here and do a paste special, values number formats, and transpose, and I'm going to say this is cost of goods sold. I guess I should, to be consistent, underline that. And I'm also going to grab the headings And remember, I don't have all of the ones that I have up here, so don't be frustrating the snot out of yourself. And then the other one I'm looking at is S, G, and A. Selling, general, and administrative. And I'm going back to my actuals. I'm going to grab the numbers, copy, come back to where I'm going to stick them, and do the same thing. Paste special, values, whoops, that's not the right values, and number formats, and then transpose. Okay. So the last thing I need to put here is my X variable. And now I'm just getting the last few years. And the reason I'm doing this, by the way, is so that when I do this sort of thing, I actually end up with headings. If you're wondering, why am I doing that? If I have the numbers up there, what in the heck are you doing? That's why I'm doing it, okay? At this point, we need to go to the data and data analysis and regression. And now Y variable is, in this case, cost of goods sold. And my X variable is sales. I have labels in the first row, excuse me, and I'm going to say output range, stop being stupid, and I'm going to go next door to that, so it's in F23 in my case. I don't know where it is in your case, but that's where it is in my case. So again, B23 to B29, I should make sure that the 23 and the 23 and the 29 and the 29 are all nicely lined up. By the way, I could have done it up here with my sales. The problem is it's harder to figure out whether my columns, or I have just as many X variables as I do Y's, and if I don't, this thing really has issues with me. And the other problem that I would have had is I would have had a label that was going to have to really be a number, and that, no. So having said all of that, I'm going to say okie dokie, go down here and take a quick look. This is not statistically significant because our sample size is puny. And for it to be statistically significant, the significance F or this p-value, and you'll notice they're exactly the same in this instance, and they are up here as well. But this would have to be less than 0.05. This one is, because we have a larger sample size for one thing. And that's the first one. The second one we're going to be looking at is regression, and it's already highlighted. Okay. The only thing I'm going to change on here is the Y variable, which is now this one. We still have the same X variable, and in this instance I am going to go down here and try to figure out where I'm going to put this. It looks like in this column, because I'm going to be missing all of that, and this row, so they'll nicely line up. And so I'll say okie dokie. So this is the summary output for my cost of goods sold, and this is my summary output for S, G, and A. Now this one has a really crappy adjusted R squared, and when the regular R squared is practically nothing. The R squared over here, well, not that great either. Again, we want those to be as close to 1 as they could possibly be, and these are really sucky, to be honest with you. But I'm going to use one of these and not the other one, and it's not the one you'd think. This one doesn't make sense to me, because as I get more and more sales, I'm expecting more and more cost of goods sold, and for everything I sell, there's an associated cost. There's no real fixed cost. I'm selling goods. I mean, there may be some economies of scale built into the cost of goods sold, but it would be not as big of a deal. These are primarily just variable costs. The selling general administrative expenses, however, are not that way. They actually make more sense that there would be some fixed costs, like I may be renting certain things. Doesn't matter whether I have any sales at all or a bunch of sales. I may be renting something and those wouldn't change at all. Whereas I may have some things that do go up and down with sales, but they may not be exact. And so this selling general and administrative expenses makes a heck of a lot more sense as a fixed and variable component. So this one, just so we can see it, the intercept term. In fact, let me move these over just a hair so I can label these properly. I'm going to grab these and move them over just one and say, by the way, this is the fixed cost. And these are the variable costs. So it's almost 4 cents per dollar in variable costs and a whole bunch of fixed costs. So if these cost of goods sold are not to be modeled this way, and it was the best of the two models, wow, that's pretty lame, then how should I model it? Best way of modeling it, if it's purely variable, is looking at my common size income statement, because these are percent of sales. So this one's 66% of sales, that's 65% of sales. I can see that there's been a little bit of a trend. If there's been any trend, it's been getting more and more and more expensive. So as I come over here, I'm going to say, well, the last one was 65.88%. I think I'm going to go for 66.5%. But it can't keep going up forever, otherwise I'll be selling shoes for cheaper than I'm paying for them eventually. So I'm going to hold it there. I'm going to say this is going to be equal to 0.665 times sales. I'm going to pull that formula across so that it will do that all the way across. By the way, you will hopefully notice that these are actually going down now rather nicely. Selling general and administrative expenses. This one I'm going to use the formula y equals mx plus b, but remember I set that backwards, so we're going to do the y equals mx plus b formula. Okay, so y equals, I'm going to move over here, and there's the variable cost first. Anything off of this sheet though needs the F4 times sales for that time period. There are the sales for that time period, plus the fixed component, which is there. And I'm going to have to hit F4, enter. This one's going up slightly as the sales go up slightly. As I look at these others, again, they're really not tied to sales because they have been zeros almost every single time. So what I'm going to do instead is I think I'm going to copy this line and paste special formats because I need the line underneath it. Then I'm going to get rid of everything else here because I'm thinking that these are all going to be zeros. So I'm going to delete. Gain on bargain purchase. It's only happened once in the last 6 years. Again, I think I'm going to get rid of that one. Delete. Other always has something in it, but it's different. It can be negative. It can be positive. I could say, what is the average percent of sales, except I really don't think this is tied to sales. So instead, let me go back and look at what the average number is. This is the actual over the last 6 years income statement. And again, I'm going to grab this one and say, what is the average number? Well, it's 239,177. If you highlight, you look at the bottom, it should say average. By the way, if it doesn't, just right click on the bottom and choose the one that will say average, and it will then. Okay, so you can actually tailor this a little bit in Excel. So I'm going to be looking at 239,177. 2 39,177. And then I'm going to hold that constant. Boom. And let's see, did I get something for everything? There's a sales line, a cost of goods line, a selling general and administrative line, income from operations, interest expense, other. Yeah, I've got something on every stinking line. So we now have a complete income statement. And by the way, I'm going to now get all of my colors off. So I'm going to say no fill, and we're back in business there. Let me go back to PowerPoint and see what now we have to do. At this point, we're just going to finish up by coming up with one last little statement at the bottom of our page. So once we end up with an estimate of net income, we'll combine a simplified statement of retained earnings to the bottom of the projected income statement. The reason we're doing this, by the way, is to transition from stuff that we've earned. So here's our net income. How much of that are we retaining and how much of it are we giving back as a dividend? That's really the question here. And so we're going to base our how much are they going to be paying in dividends on the dividend policy stuff that we did at the end of chapter 14. The big difference here is when we were looking at the end of chapter 14, we tended to look at dividends per share. At this point, we're looking at total dividends from the entire company, which is why, by the way, I kept my number of shares. Yeah, it gave me my earnings per share estimates, but that wasn't the real issue. So I have these estimates of weighted average number of shares outstanding. So with that as an intro, let me go back and apply all of this to actual retained or statement of retained earnings. I'm going to scroll down here and actually come up to a blank space and say, let's do a statement of retained earnings. By the way, you'll notice that everything else on here, I don't know why, because I don't really like it anymore, but one time, I guess when I started this, I kind of liked Times New Roman. I'm going to go up here and get rid of my I'm going to actually make everything the same, Times New Roman, even whether I like it or not. I'm going to center this and bold it and then center it that way. So we're going to have total dividends paid. By the way, these typically appear to be about 10 fonts. I want these to actually fit in and look the same. Now, in the past, if you go back and look at our, hopefully, one of the latter videos, you'll note that Rocky Brands has actually paid only 6 quarterly dividends. They were the last 6 quarters, and every single one of them has been 10 cents per share. Now, I can't put 10 cents down here because that's not going to say, oh, let's see, we made $2.7 million and we paid 10 cents. It's not going to make a dent in it at all. Besides that, I paid 10 cents per quarter. That means 40 cents per year. And I paid it to all 7 million shareholders. So when I look at my total dividends paid, I'm going to be saying equals 0.4 times all of my shareholders. At this point, I do need to format, and I'm going to pull that one across. Now, by the way, if I change any of my inputs here, these will automatically change. So that's the best part of Excel, by the way. And now we're going to be looking at our estimated change in retained earnings. I'm going to move across, say equal net income minus dividends paid out. And you'll notice in this first instance we have a negative $242,000. Ooh. Now, if that turned the total retained earnings negative, we would have a problem. But won't. In fact, let me see. That will, and what we're going to be doing with this is it's going to say negative 242,000 plus how much we had in retained earnings thus far. Retained earnings is just trying to say how much of the company has the equity people paid for, either in their initial investment or in money that they made, the $2.7 million, that was actually just retained in the firm. If we look at their balance sheet, you'll notice their retained earnings right now is $61 million. I think they can take a hit of $250,000 without going negative. Therefore, we shouldn't have a problem. At this point, this is where we need to stop with our income statement projection. We have net income projected. It seems to be growing. We have some nice earnings per share. And we have projected our statement of retained earnings, including here's how much we're going to be adjusting our retained earnings on our balance sheet. Which leads us up to our next video, which is going to be projecting the balance sheet.